Story 1. The Peculiar Punishments of Tudor Tailors. When you imagine Tudor England, your mind may go to the royal court of Henry VIII with its shimmering gowns, or to Elizabeth I in her stiffened ruffs and brilliant silks. Yet outside the court, in the streets of London, Norwich, or York, there were men who labored quietly with shears, chalk, and thread, bound by rules so numerous that their trade was less about creativity and more about obedience. These men were tailors, and their craft, though humble, was central to Tudor society. It was also one of the most regulated and punished professions of the time. To understand the peculiar punishments of Tudor tailors, one must begin with the importance of cloth itself. In the 16th century, clothing was more than fabric stitched together. It was a visible marker of wealth, status, and morality. Laws known as the sumptuary laws dictated who could wear velvet, who might don silk, and who must remain in wool. A tailor, therefore, stood at the crossroads of legality and vanity. His scissors could defy the order of society by giving a humble merchant's wife sleeves too grand for her station, or by fitting a clerk into a doublet that suggested gentility. This placed the tailor in a precarious position. The punishment for overstepping the rules was not always dramatic, but it was often humiliating, tedious, and deeply symbolic. Tailors might be fined for using more cloth than was lawful, or forced to unpick entire garments before officials. Some were summoned to sit through long public hearings, not as grand criminals, but as weary examples of regulation enforced. The everyday life of a Tudor tailor. Imagine the narrow, crowded streets of Tudor London. Tailors' shops were usually little more than wooden stalls or small rooms, often situated near marketplaces. A customer would enter, bringing with them bolts of cloth or old garments to be reshaped. The tailor's tools were few but essential: heavy iron shears, wooden yardsticks marked in L's, a measurement just over 45 inches, chalk for marking lines, and long needles that demanded steady hands. Work was slow. There were no sewing machines. Each stitch had to be placed with patience. Tailors often employed apprentices who, for years, would do little more than press seams, fetch materials, and sweep floors before being allowed to handle cloth themselves. Apprenticeship lasted 7 years, sometimes longer, and the guilds ensured that even these mundane details were regulated. But the real burden on the tailor was not the slowness of the work, it was the constant anxiety of rules. Every garment had to be made within the boundaries of what the law allowed. To use too much fabric was to waste resources. To give a sleeve too much width was to edge into forbidden luxury. The tailor's life was one of measurements, not only of cloth but of obedience. Sumptuary laws, clothing as control. The Tudor monarchy, like many before it, used clothing laws to keep society in order. It was believed that if the poor dressed like the rich, chaos would follow. Each rank of society had its assigned fabrics and colors. A knight's family might wear satin, while a yeoman was restricted to wool. Gold or silver thread was permitted only for those with noble titles. Even the colors carried restrictions. Purple, associated with royalty since ancient Rome, was limited to the highest ranks. Tailors were not merely craftsmen, they were enforcers of this invisible hierarchy. The crown expected them to obey the laws and, by extension, to police their customers. If a tailor cut a gown too generously for a tradesman's wife, both he and his client might be punished. In this way, the tailor's shears became an instrument of discipline. Yet here is where the punishments grew peculiar. Rather than severe torture or execution, the penalties often reflected the boring, yet burdensome realities of Tudor life. A tailor might be fined a sum so modest that it barely covered his day's wages, yet the real punishment was the waste of time in traveling to court, wading through proceedings, and sitting beneath the scolding of officials. Others were ordered to remake garments entirely, undoing days of labor stitch by stitch. In a society where every hour of work mattered, such punishments were exhausting. The guild's heavy hand. Most tailors were members of guilds, local associations that regulated their craft. Guilds controlled who could open a shop, how long apprentices must serve, and even what hours one might work. They also set punishments for those who broke guild rules. For example, a tailor who opened his shop on a Sunday might be fined, not heavily, but consistently, until the irritation of paying small penalties pressed him into obedience. Another who accepted an apprentice without permission from the guild might be forced to appear before the guild's elders, sitting through tedious lectures that could last for hours. These moments were not exciting or brutal. They were dull, drawn out, and carefully designed to wear down defiance. And yet boredom was the point. Tudor society relied on long, drawn-out procedures to reinforce authority. The tedium of waiting, of being corrected in public, of undoing one's work, was itself a punishment. Tailors and the symbolism of punishment. Why were tailors punished in such peculiar ways? Partly because they dealt with symbols, clothes that represented order. Punishments for tailors were often designed to reinforce those symbols. If a tailor mismeasured cloth, he might be forced to display the wasted fragments, an object lesson in the value of material. If he defied sumptuary laws, he might be ordered to parade through town holding the offending garment, showing everyone that luxury had been brought low. These punishments were rarely bloody. They were not intended to terrify but to remind. The message was, order lies not only in the gallows but in the inches of cloth, in the hours lost, and in the humility of undoing labor. The peculiar case of the doublet too long. One oft-quoted example from civic records tells of a tailor fined for cutting a doublet with skirts longer than the law allowed. The punishment was not imprisonment, nor was it a whipping. Instead, the man was summoned before local magistrates and required to unpick the garment in their presence. The customer was forced to watch as the tailor destroyed the very thing he had labored over. The waste of time, the humiliation, and the public display of wasted cloth all were carefully chosen to reinforce the authority of law. Such punishments, though tedious, tell us much about Tudor England. This was a world where rules seeped into the smallest corners of life, where the cut of a sleeve might be as politically charged as the signing of a treaty. The weight of the needle. As you think of the tailor in his dim shop, bent over cloth by candlelight, imagine the weight that rested on his shoulders. Each cut, each stitch, could draw the attention of officials. His punishments would not echo in ballads or be recorded in grand histories, but they shaped his daily life. They were punishments that lived in the quiet corners of time, lost wages, wasted cloth, and the endless waiting in guild halls. And so, the story of Tudor tailors is not one of dramatic rebellion or bloody reprisal. It is a story of quiet discipline, of peculiar punishments designed to keep order in a world measured by elsticks and overseen by guild masters. But here a question lingers. If tailors lived under such heavy scrutiny, how did they cope with the constant pressure? Did they find small ways to resist, or did they surrender fully to the tedium of their punishments? In the first part of this story, you saw the tailor's life under rules and punishments that were more exhausting than terrifying. But punishment alone does not tell the full tale. Where there are rules, there are always small rebellions. Where there is tedium, there is always a temptation to find ways around it. In Tudor England, tailors were neither heroes nor villains. They were ordinary men, trying to earn their bread while surviving in a system that bound them with regulations. Yet within this dull web of control, there were quiet strategies, subtle acts of defiance, and occasional bursts of rebellion. The tailor's quiet resistance. Resistance for a tailor rarely looked dramatic. Instead of open defiance, it appeared in the smallest of stitches. Consider, for instance, the matter of cloth. A tailor might measure 1.5 yards when the law permitted only 1 yard. He would cut the sleeve generously, but ever so slightly, in a way that could pass unnoticed unless closely inspected. The difference might allow a merchant's wife to wear a gown that suggested higher rank, or a young clerk to stride with an extra touch of authority. These acts of resistance were risky. If discovered, the tailor would face fines or humiliation. But often, customers themselves demanded such quiet defiance. They wanted to appear wealthier than they were. And so, the tailor became not only a craftsman but a conspirator in ambition. Over time, tailors developed reputations. Some were known for strict obedience, making garments plain and lawful. Others, whispered about in marketplaces, were said to be willing to add a little extra or cut as the customer wished. It was not rebellion with banners or swords. It was rebellion with shears and chalk. Guild control tightens. Guilds, of course, were aware of this behavior. Records show that guild elders spent long meetings discussing how to prevent tailors from breaking rules. They introduced inspections, where officials might walk into a shop and measure a garment in progress. They also demanded that apprentices spy on masters, reporting irregularities in exchange for favor or advancement. Yet the guild's methods were never perfect. A clever tailor might keep two garments on his bench, one lawful, for inspection, and another, tucked aside, meant for the customer who demanded more luxury. Punishments grew more peculiar in response. Tailors accused of deceit were sometimes ordered to sit through sermons on morality or to write out copies of guild regulations by hand, line after line. Imagine a weary man, needle in one pocket, quill in the other, scratching out the same rules over and over, as if the repetition itself could cure his disobedience. Such measures reflected a society deeply invested in boredom as a tool of control. It was not pain that shaped the tailor's obedience, but the dullness of ritual, the waste of hours, and the grinding weight of rules repeated until they carved themselves into memory. The apprentice's dilemma. Apprentices played a special role in this dance of resistance and punishment. Bound to their masters for 7 long years, they were expected to obey, to learn, and to remain loyal. Yet apprentices often bore the brunt of punishment when rules were broken. A master might claim ignorance, shifting blame onto the boy who had cut the cloth. Apprentices could be whipped, not savagely, but enough to instill caution. More often they were punished with labor, days spent unpicking seams, nights forced to remake garments by candlelight, hours spent running errands in rain or mud. Apprentices also lived under constant threat of being dismissed, a fate that left them without skill, without livelihood, and without place. But some apprentices resisted. They sabotaged their master's work, deliberately botching seams or dulling shears. Others ran away, joining bands of journeymen who moved from town to town, taking work where they could. Such men often lived on the edge of legality, stitching garments in back rooms, defying both guild and crown. The law versus fashion. One of the greatest struggles for tailors was the tension between law and fashion. Fashion moved quickly in Tudor England, driven by the court. What the king or queen wore in London soon echoed in the provinces. Wide sleeves, slashed doublets, padded hose, these styles demanded more cloth, more daring cuts, but laws lagged behind. A tailor who followed fashion too closely risked breaking regulations. Punishments in such cases were sometimes absurd. In Norwich, records describe tailors being fined for making breeches too wide. In London, a tailor was summoned for sewing sleeves that hung too low. Imagine a man brought before officials, not for theft or violence, but because his sleeve pattern had been too generous by a few inches. The punishment was not prison but tedium, hours of explanation, lectures from elders, fines that drained his earnings, and sometimes, the ultimate insult, being ordered to wear his error. A tailor might be forced to don the offending garment himself, parading it through town as a living example of excess. Fashion, however, could not be stopped. Customers demanded the newest looks, and tailors who refused lost business. This tension ensured that tailors lived in a constant state of risk, balancing law with livelihood. The social cost of disobedience. Tailors who broke rules did not always suffer alone. Their families bore the cost. A fine meant less food on the table. Days spent unpicking garments or sitting in court meant lost wages. Wives and children lived with the uncertainty of whether their household could withstand another penalty. And reputation mattered. A tailor publicly punished might see customers drift away, fearing association with lawbreaking. Others, however, might gain customers who admired defiance. The line between shame and admiration was thin, and much depended on the whisper of neighbors in the marketplace. A society of small rebellions. Looking at the broader picture, the punishments of tailors reveal something deeper about Tudor England. This was not a society where power was enforced only by swords and scaffolds. It was a society maintained by countless small rules, each enforced with tedious precision. Tailors became symbols of this quiet enforcement. Their resistance, too, was small. It was not the grand rebellion of nobles or the uprisings of peasants. It was the silent stitch, the extra inch, the whispered promise to a customer that no one will notice. These acts did not topple kings, but they chipped away at the boundaries of control, showing that even in a world of rules, human desire for status and beauty could not be fully contained. Toward greater tensions. By the late Tudor period, the tension between law, fashion, and survival only grew. Tailors faced increasing pressure as clothing styles became more elaborate and as the guilds tightened control. The punishments, too, became more inventive, reflecting a desperate attempt to hold back change. And so we are left with a question. As fashions grew grander and punishments grew stranger, did the tailors themselves begin to break under the strain, or did they find new ways to bend the rules and survive? The story of Tudor tailors has so far shown you the weight of rules, the quiet strategies of resistance, and the peculiar punishments designed to control them. But history does not remain static. By the late 16th century, the world of the tailor was changing. England was shifting under the rule of Elizabeth I, commerce was expanding, and clothing was becoming ever more central to identity. In this final section, we trace how these punishments reached their height, how they slowly unraveled, and what their legacy reveals about the society that created them. The peak of peculiarity. In the last decades of the Tudor era, punishments for tailors reached new heights of peculiarity. Records from London's guild courts describe elaborate rituals of humiliation. Tailors who broke regulations were sometimes ordered to stand at the doors of churches during Sunday services, holding a pair of shears tied shut with ribbon, a symbol of their supposed misuse of tools. Others were forced to post written apologies outside their shops, pinned to the very doors through which customers entered. One notable example comes from Norwich, where a tailor who repeatedly ignored restrictions on sleeve size was ordered to appear in the marketplace wearing a tunic made from rough sackcloth, cut deliberately too short, with sleeves comically narrow. The punishment was not physical pain but ridicule. He was made a living advertisement for obedience, a warning that even the smallest act of disobedience could be turned into a spectacle. The absurdity of these punishments reveals something important. The authorities were not simply concerned with cloth. They were concerned with control. Every sleeve, every seam, was a symbol of order in a world where hierarchy mattered deeply. The cloth trade expands. As England's economy expanded through overseas trade, cloth became even more important. Wool was the kingdom's greatest export, and merchants grew wealthy selling English cloth abroad. Tailors, therefore, sat at the heart of an industry that reached beyond the village or city. Their work carried the weight of national pride, for poorly made garments reflected badly on English craftsmanship. With trade came new fabrics, fine linens, silks, and exotic dyes that challenged the old sumptuary laws. How could guilds enforce rules on materials that had never before reached English shores? Punishments grew increasingly outdated. A tailor might be fined for using too much wool, but what of a garment made from imported satin? Officials struggled to keep pace, and tailors exploited the gaps, slipping new fashions into their work under the cover of novelty. In this environment, punishments became less effective. Customers demanded styles influenced by Europe, and tailors who refused lost their trade. To survive, many risked punishment, gambling that fines or humiliations were less damaging than losing patrons. The slow decline of sumptuary laws. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, the sumptuary laws themselves were weakening. They had always been difficult to enforce, requiring endless inspections and petty punishments. As wealth spread more widely among merchants and professionals, distinctions of dress became harder to maintain. A wealthy tradesman could afford silk, even if the law said he should not. And when enough people ignored the rules, enforcement became a burden too heavy to carry. For tailors, this shift meant both relief and danger. Relief, because the pressure of rules began to ease. Danger, because without the constant oversight of laws, competition grew sharper. Customers now sought the most fashionable garments, and tailors who could not adapt risked ruin. Punishments faded, but the demands of fashion grew harsher. The legacy of peculiar punishments. Looking back, the peculiar punishments of Tudor tailors may seem almost laughable. Fines for wide sleeves, humiliations for long doublets, tedious lectures on guild rules, these were not the stuff of rebellion or tragedy. Yet they reveal the fabric of Tudor life in ways that gallows and battles cannot. They show a society where order was maintained not only by grand displays of royal power, but also by the minute regulation of daily life. They remind us that history is often shaped by the boring details. The size of a sleeve, the width of a seam, the hours lost in guild halls. For tailors, these punishments were not trivial. They shaped careers, strained families, and tested loyalties. They created an environment where every cut of cloth carried risk, and where obedience was measured not in loyalty to the crown alone, but in the patience to endure fines, lectures, and humiliations. Modern echoes. Even now you can see echoes of this system. Modern industries, too, impose endless rules, safety regulations, quality standards, trade restrictions. And workers like Tudor tailors must navigate them carefully, sometimes bending the rules, sometimes enduring the tedium of inspections and audits. The punishments are rarely brutal, but they are wearying hours of paperwork, fines, or the humiliation of public correction. In this way, the peculiar punishments of Tudor tailors are not as distant as they seem. They remind us that much of history is not about the dramatic, but about the dull, about how ordinary people survived in systems designed to control them through patience and persistence. Closing reflection. As you close your eyes on this story, think of the tailor in his dim workshop, needle in hand, shears at his side. Around him swirled a world of laws, punishments, and pressures. Yet still he stitched. Still he cut cloth for those who came to him, balancing obedience with quiet defiance. His punishments may seem peculiar, even boring, but they held meaning for his time, and they shaped the way society saw order and identity. And so we ask, when the smallest of stitches could defy authority, was the tailor truly a prisoner of his trade, or was he quietly, patiently, sewing his way to freedom? Story 2. The Long Wait: Medieval Guild Apprenticeships and Their Rules. If you were a child in medieval England or anywhere in late medieval Europe, your future might be determined not by your talents or your desires, but by the decision of your parents and the needs of your community. For many boys and a few girls, this meant the long road of apprenticeship. It was not glamorous. It was not short. It was 7 years, sometimes more, of obedience, drudgery, and waiting. Guild apprenticeships were the backbone of medieval trade. They produced tailors, shoemakers, bakers, masons, and carpenters. They were the silent engines that kept towns alive. But apprenticeships were also systems of control, binding children into contracts that shaped nearly every detail of their daily lives. The long wait of apprenticeship was not only the wait for mastery, but also the wait for adulthood itself. The apprentice's oath. At the heart of apprenticeship lay the oath. A boy, often no older than 12 or 13, would stand before guild officials, a priest, or a city clerk. With his parents beside him, he would swear loyalty to a master for 7 years. He promised to serve, to obey, to keep secrets of the craft, and never to marry without permission. He swore not to gamble, not to steal, not to waste his master's goods. The oath was comprehensive, covering every imaginable temptation, as if the guild suspected that any boy left unchecked would ruin both himself and the craft. This was not a contract in the modern sense. It was a vow, binding in both law and morality. To break it was to risk fines, shame, or expulsion from the guild system, altogether a fate that left a young man without trade, without status, and often without hope. The life of an apprentice. Once the oath was taken, life narrowed into routine. Apprentices rose early, often before dawn, to begin their work. Their tasks were rarely connected to the higher skills of the trade. A tailor's apprentice might spend years pressing seams or sweeping floors. A baker's apprentice hauled sacks of flour, cleaned ovens, and fetched water. A mason's apprentice carried stone, mixed mortar, and learned to endure the weight of tools before ever shaping a block. Meals were plain and often shared with the master's family. Apprentices lived in the household, sleeping on benches or in lofts, their lives entirely folded into their master's world. Privacy was almost non-existent. Every word, every action was subject to observation and correction. And yet this long wait was by design. The guilds believed that mastery came not only from skill but from character. Apprenticeship was meant to wear down pride, to instill patience, and to teach obedience. A boy might dream of cutting fine cloth or carving grand arches, but first he had to endure the boring, necessary years of servitude. Rules within rules. Guilds imposed not only the oath but also a dense web of rules. Apprentices were forbidden from carrying weapons, from playing dice, from visiting taverns without permission. They were warned against keeping company with prostitutes, against borrowing money, against leaving town. In many places, they could not even marry until their apprenticeship was complete. Breaking these rules brought punishments, not of dramatic violence but of tedious burden. An apprentice caught gambling might be ordered to copy guild regulations by hand. Another who fought in the street could be confined to his master's workshop for weeks, allowed out only to fetch water or wood. Some were fined, the cost taken directly from their wages or, more often, from the wages they had not yet earned, for apprentices rarely received pay at all. These rules were as much about control as about craft. They made apprentices into steady, predictable members of society. A guild was not merely training a worker, it was shaping a citizen. The long wait for freedom. For the apprentice, freedom lay far ahead. 7 years stretched endlessly. Imagine beginning at 12 and emerging at 19, having spent your entire adolescence under the watchful eye of a master. Each day blurred into the next, filled with small tasks and endless reminders of duty. But there was a promise at the end, the chance to become a journeyman, to travel, to earn wages, to carve out a place in the world. The wait, though long and dull, was the price of stability. It was a trade-off between youthful freedom and adult security. The weight on families. Apprenticeship was not only a burden for the apprentice, it weighed heavily on families. Parents often had to pay a fee to the master for taking on their child. This fee, called a premium, varied by craft and by the status of the family. For poorer households, it was a sacrifice, sometimes requiring years of saving. In exchange, parents placed their trust in the master. They entrusted him not only to teach the trade but also to feed, clothe, and discipline their child. If the master failed, if he was cruel, negligent, or dishonest, the family could petition the guild for intervention. But such petitions were slow, tedious, and often fruitless. Many apprentices simply endured. Small acts of rebellion. Of course, apprentices did not always accept their fate passively. Some found ways to rebel. They snuck into taverns, played dice in alleyways, or courted girls despite the rules. Others ran away entirely, abandoning their oath to seek freedom in another town. Runaways were pursued by guild officials, and could be punished harshly if caught, sometimes returned in chains, sometimes forced to begin their term anew. Yet even rebellion was part of the rhythm of apprenticeship. Masters expected some disobedience. The system was not designed to crush rebellion completely, but to absorb it, to make the long years of obedience more binding by contrasting them with moments of punishment. A dull but defining system. From the outside, the world of apprenticeships might seem dull, endless rules, endless waiting, endless obedience. But for medieval towns, apprenticeships were vital. They ensured that trades survived, that skills were passed on, that society remained orderly. They also taught resilience. To endure 7 years of tedium required patience, and patience itself was seen as a virtue. In many ways, apprenticeships mirrored the wider society of the Middle Ages. Life was long, slow, and bound by rules. Advancement came only after years of obedience. The long wait was not simply for mastery of a trade. It was for the chance to step into adulthood at all. Toward journeymanship. And so we are left with a question. What happened when the long wait finally ended? How did apprentices transform into journeymen, and what freedoms and new restrictions awaited them when they left their master's house? The end of an apprenticeship was both a liberation and a new kind of bondage. After 7 long years or sometimes more, a young man stepped out from his master's household and into the uncertain world of the journeyman. He was no longer a boy bound by oath to obedience, but neither was he yet a master. He stood in the middle ground, carrying his tools in a bundle, his hopes in his pocket, and his future balanced between freedom and control. The meaning of journeyman. The word journeyman comes from the French journée, meaning day. It signified that the craftsman was paid by the day, unlike an apprentice who received no wages, and unlike a master who owned his own shop. A journeyman traveled from town to town, offering his labor where it was needed, earning coin for each day's work. This system served multiple purposes. It gave the young craftsman the chance to see different techniques, to broaden his knowledge, and to prove his worth. It also kept him humble, reminding him that mastery was not granted immediately after apprenticeship. He had more to learn, more to endure, and more to wait for. The life on the road. Journeymen traveled on foot, carrying their shears, chisels, or hammers wrapped in cloth. They followed roads that were often muddy in winter, dusty in summer, and dangerous in all seasons. Bandits, wolves, and sickness were constant risks, yet the road was also a place of fellowship. Journeymen often traveled in groups, sharing bread and beer, swapping stories of masters they had served and towns they had seen. Lodging was uncertain. Some slept in guild hostels where available, others found shelter in barns, taverns, or the homes of fellow craftsmen. Payment was modest, often just enough to cover food and lodging, with little left to save. The dream of opening one's own shop seemed far away, a distant goal that required patience and thrift. Guild supervision continues. Freedom on the road did not mean freedom from guild rules. Journeymen were still expected to obey local regulations wherever they worked. They were often required to register with the guild upon arriving in a new town, proving that they had completed their apprenticeship. In some places, they had to present letters of recommendation from their former masters. Punishments for journeymen were as tedious as ever. A man who failed to register might be fined or forced to sit through long lectures on guild order. A journeyman caught working without permission could be expelled, his tools confiscated until he paid a fee. Even outside the master's house, guilds kept tight control, using paperwork, inspections, and petty penalties to remind journeymen that they were not yet fully free. Tests of skill. For many crafts, a journeyman's path led eventually to the masterpiece, a work created to prove his skill before the guild. A carpenter might build a chest, a tailor might cut and sew a full suit, a goldsmith might fashion a delicate ornament. The work was judged not only for quality but for obedience to guild standards. Failure meant delay. A journeyman might be forced to wait years before being allowed to try again. Success meant admission into the ranks of the masters, with the right to open a shop, take on apprentices, and vote in guild affairs. The masterpiece was a gatekeeper, and the guilds guarded it carefully. By making the test demanding, they limited the number of new masters, ensuring that competition remained manageable. Journeymen thus lived in a long twilight, skilled but not yet recognized, free but still bound. The journeyman's brotherhood. Despite the restrictions, journeymen created their own sense of identity. In some towns, they formed fraternities or brotherhoods, groups that offered support, protection, and companionship. These brotherhoods often had their own rituals, songs, and feasts, giving journeymen a community outside the guilds. At times, these groups clashed with the guilds. Journeymen might strike for better wages, refusing to work until masters met their demands. Such disputes were rare but significant, revealing that even within the tightly regulated world of medieval trades, workers could assert their power. The burden of waiting. For the journeyman, the greatest burden was not the road or the rules, but the waiting. Years might pass as he traveled, saved, and prepared for the chance to submit his masterpiece. Some never reached mastery at all. They remained journeymen for life, respected but limited, always dependent on the work of others. The long wait of apprenticeship had prepared them for this. Patience, obedience, and endurance were not only virtues but survival skills. To be a journeyman was to live in uncertainty, never knowing where the next day's work might come, but always carrying the hope of eventual independence. Journeymen and society. Journeymen played an important role in society beyond their trades. They carried ideas from town to town, spreading techniques, fashions, and news. They were mobile in a world where most people never left their birthplace. Their journeys connected towns, linked guilds, and ensured that knowledge flowed across regions. At the same time, they were outsiders everywhere they went. They belonged fully to no community, always moving, always temporary. Their status reflected the transitional nature of youth in medieval society, neither child nor fully adult, neither dependent nor fully free. Toward mastery or stagnation. As we follow the journeyman on his road, we are left with another question. What happened when he finally reached the threshold of mastery? Did the guild welcome him with open arms, or did it guard its privileges so tightly that only a few could cross? We have followed the apprentice through his long years of waiting and the journeyman through his uncertain travels. Now we arrive at the final stage, the test of mastery. This was not merely a trial of skill. It was a ritual, a gate, and a negotiation with the guild itself. To become a master was to cross into a world of responsibility, privilege, and new burdens. Yet, as you will see, the path was steep, the rules rigid, and the waiting not always rewarded. The masterpiece. The masterpiece was the crowning achievement of a journeyman's career. The word has survived in modern language, but in its original sense, it meant a literal piece of work crafted under strict conditions and judged by guild elders. Each trade had its own requirements. A carpenter might be asked to build a chest with hidden joints. A goldsmith might fashion a delicate brooch, weighing no more than the prescribed ounces. A tailor might cut and sew a full set of garments, measured exactly to guild standards. A mason might carve a block with intricate patterns, demonstrating both precision and endurance. The masterpiece was not meant to inspire beauty alone. It was meant to prove obedience. The rules for its construction were often tediously specific, exact dimensions, approved materials, and methods that reflected tradition rather than innovation. To deviate, even if the result was beautiful, was to fail. Failure was common. A journeyman who erred might be told to wait another year, to attempt the test again, or to accept permanent journeyman status. For some, the long wait never ended. Fees, favors, and the price of admission. Even beyond skill, the road to mastery was expensive. A journeyman had to pay fees to the guild, sometimes enough to equal several months' wages. He was expected to host a feast for the elders upon his admission, supplying food, drink, and entertainment. He might also need the favor of a wealthy patron or the recommendation of a respected master. Thus, mastery was not simply a matter of talent. It was a blend of patience, savings, connections, and sometimes luck. The guilds guarded their numbers carefully. Too many masters meant too much competition. By raising the barriers through strict tests and high fees, they ensured that only a select few advanced. For those who succeeded, mastery brought status. They could open their own shop, take on apprentices, and vote in guild meetings. They joined the ranks of respected townsmen, responsible not only for their trade but for the order of the community. The burden of mastery. Yet mastery was not pure freedom. Masters carried new obligations. They had to enforce guild rules, supervise apprentices, and uphold the reputation of their craft. They were subject to inspections and fines, just as journeymen and apprentices had been. They had more autonomy, but they also bore more responsibility. A master tailor, for instance, might face punishment if his apprentice was caught gambling, or if his journeyman shirked duties. A master mason might be fined for hiring too many outside laborers. The guild's reach extended into every level, ensuring that even those at the top remained bound by rules. The many who never made it. For every journeyman who became a master, many never crossed the threshold. Some lacked the money, others the skill, and others the patience. They remained journeymen for life, wandering from town to town, respected for their labor but denied the privileges of ownership. These lifelong journeymen filled an essential role. They provided labor when masters could not supply enough, kept crafts moving, and ensured that towns functioned. Yet they lived always on the edge of security, dependent on the needs of others. Their stories are mostly lost in the silence of history, overshadowed by the names of guild leaders and successful masters. Apprenticeship as a social order. When viewed in full, the system of apprenticeship was more than a way to train craftsmen. It was a social order in miniature. It structured childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. It bound families to masters, masters to guilds, and guilds to towns. It taught patience, obedience, and the endurance of tedium. For medieval society, the system worked. It ensured that skills were preserved, that trades remained stable, and that young men were guided through the long years between boyhood and independence. For the individuals who endured it, however, the long wait was often wearying, filled with rules, delays, and frustrations. A legacy of waiting. Today, the echoes of apprenticeship linger. Modern professions still require long periods of training, internships, or junior roles. The patience demanded of a law clerk, a medical resident, or an apprentice electrician is not so different from that of a medieval tailor's boy. The details have changed, but the principle remains. Mastery comes slowly, through years of waiting, obedience, and endurance. Closing reflection. As you picture the journeyman standing before the guild elders, masterpiece in hand, think of the years that brought him there. The boy who once swept floors has become a man, shaped by rules, patience, and persistence. If the elders nod in approval, his wait is over. If they frown, the waiting continues. And so we ask, in a world where mastery was so carefully guarded, was the long wait a path to fairness and skill, or was it a system designed to keep power in the hands of the few? Story 3. When ale went weak, Tudor laws on watered-down beer. To understand the peculiarities of Tudor England, you must first set aside your modern assumptions about drink. Today, ale or beer is a leisure beverage, consumed for taste or celebration. In the 16th century, however, ale was life itself. It was not a luxury but a necessity. Clean water was uncertain, milk spoiled quickly, and wine was costly. Ale, mild, nourishing, and brewed in nearly every household, was the everyday drink for men, women, and children alike. But because ale was so central to survival, it was also subject to endless regulation. The Tudors, like their medieval predecessors, passed laws that governed how strong ale should be, how much it should cost, and who could brew it. At the heart of these regulations lay one recurring problem: the temptation of brewers to water down their ale. Ale in everyday life. If you walked through a Tudor village in the early morning, you would see smoke curling from the chimneys of small brewhouses. Women, known as alewives, often brewed for their households and neighbors. In towns and cities, larger brewing operations supplied taverns and inns. The smell of malted barley, boiling hops, and yeast filled the streets. Ale was consumed at every meal. A laborer might drink a gallon a day, though it was weaker than modern beer, closer to liquid bread than intoxicating drink. Children sipped from wooden cups, and households kept barrels in storage for daily use. Because ale was so essential, its quality mattered. Weak or watery ale was not merely disappointing. It could leave a laborer undernourished, a household cheated, and a community at risk of unrest. The assize of ale. Regulation of ale stretched back to the 13th century with the assize of ale, one of England's earliest food laws. By Tudor times, the assize was deeply embedded in local governance. Officials known as ale conners were appointed in towns and villages to test the strength and quality of ale. Their methods were as curious as they were memorable. One common story tells of ale conners wearing leather breeches and sitting on a wooden bench soaked with fresh ale. After a time, they would rise. If their breeches stuck, the ale was strong enough. If they slipped easily, it was judged too weak. While this tale has been repeated often, it may be more legend than practice. More likely, ale was judged by taste, smell, and comparison to standard measures. Still, the image of the sticky breeches remains one of the more peculiar details of Tudor regulation. Punishments for weak ale. Brewers who watered down their ale faced punishments that were rarely brutal but always humiliating. Fines were common, but more theatrical penalties were preferred. In some towns, an offending brewer was ordered to carry the weak ale through the streets and pour it into the gutter, a public spectacle of waste. Others were forced to sit in the stocks with a tankard of their own inferior brew hung around their necks. Women brewers often faced the harshest ridicule. An alewife caught selling weak ale might be paraded with a false crown or forced to stand before the church door during Sunday services. The punishments, like those of Tailors, relied not on physical torment but on public shame, tedious procedures, and wasted labor. The cost of ale. Regulations also fixed the price of ale, tying it to the cost of grain. If barley prices rose, ale might legally cost more. If grain was cheap, ale had to be sold for less. This system ensured that common folk could afford their daily drink, but it left brewers with little room for profit. The temptation to water down ale, stretch ingredients, or cheat measurements was therefore constant. Local records show endless disputes over such matters. Brewers accused of cheating defended themselves with tedious explanations. The malt was poor, the water bad, the yeast weak. Officials listened, measured, and scolded. The result was rarely dramatic but always draining. Ale as social glue. Beyond nourishment, ale was central to social life. Taverns and alehouses were places where neighbors met, where news spread, and where disputes were settled. Ale was present at weddings, funerals, fairs, and feasts. Weak ale, therefore, was more than a personal disappointment. It was a disruption of community trust. The regulation of ale was not only about health or fairness. It was about maintaining order in a society where drink was both sustenance and social bond. Weak ale threatened that bond, and so the punishments, though peculiar, carried real weight. Toward greater regulation. By the 16th century, ale was beginning to give way to beer brewed with hops, a continental import that kept longer and tasted sharper. This shift only increased regulation, as officials now had to distinguish between traditional ale and hopped beer, each with its own rules. Punishments multiplied, and the line between lawful brewing and illicit watering grew ever more blurred. A question brewing. And so we end this first part with a question. In a world where ale was daily bread, how did brewers balance survival with regulation? Did they endure the tedious punishments, or did they find new ways to stretch their barrels while keeping customers satisfied? The first part of this story showed you how ale was a necessity, regulated and tested with punishments designed more to shame than to scar. But the tale deepens when we look closer at those who brewed, those who tested, and those who drank. Ale was not simply liquid bread. It was a battlefield of survival, authority, and quiet defiance. The alewife's burden. For much of the Tudor period, brewing was a woman's trade. Married women brewed for their households, often selling extra to neighbors. Widows brewed to support themselves. Even unmarried women might take up brewing as a way to earn a living. These women, known as alewives, were central figures in their communities. But with their visibility came vulnerability. Alewives were frequent targets of regulation, accused of watering their ale, cheating customers, or charging unfair prices. Local courts are filled with tedious records of women fined for weak ale, often with little evidence beyond a complaint from a dissatisfied drinker. Punishments for alewives were often designed for spectacle. Some were paraded with a tankard tied around their necks. Others were ordered to stand in public places with their barrels overturned, the wasted ale soaking into the ground. For women already struggling to earn, the loss of both dignity and product could be devastating. The social stigma lingered. Alewives became stock figures in medieval and Tudor jokes depicted as quarrelsome, dishonest, or foolish. Plays and poems mocked them, reinforcing the idea that women in trade were untrustworthy. Yet despite the ridicule and regulation, alewives endured because without them, communities would have gone thirsty. The aleconner's peculiar role. On the other side stood the aleconners, officials appointed to test the quality of ale. Their role was both necessary and peculiar. They were expected to taste, judge, and certify that ale met the required strength and price. In towns like London, aleconners even wore official garments and sat at special benches in taverns, waiting for samples. Their judgments carried legal weight, but their methods were often mocked. The story of sitting in wet ale with leather breeches may not be entirely true, but the ridicule captures something real. Aleconners were both feared and laughed at. Imagine being the man whose job was to sip tankard after tankard, deciding whether the ale was strong enough. To some, it seemed a position of privilege. To others, a symbol of tedious bureaucracy. Records suggest aleconners themselves sometimes faced suspicion accused of favoritism, bribery, or simply of enjoying their work too much. Regulation in practice. The daily enforcement of ale laws was less dramatic than the legends suggest. In practice, it was a cycle of inspections, fines, and weary explanations. Brewers summoned to court defended themselves with endless detail. The malt had been weak, the fire too hot, the fermentation spoiled. Officials listened, recorded, and punished in small, persistent ways. The punishments were rarely violent, but they were draining. Fines chipped away at profits. Public shamming damaged reputations. Wasted ale meant wasted grain, a serious loss in a world where food was never abundant. And the process itself summons, appearances, scolding consumed time that could otherwise have been spent brewing more ale. Ale and community trust. At the heart of these regulations was trust. Ale was not bottled or standardized. Each batch was unique, its quality dependent on grain, water, yeast, and skill. Customers had to trust their brewer. Regulations were meant to safeguard that trust, ensuring that when a laborer paid for a tankard, he received nourishment, not watered-down disappointment. But regulation also reflected suspicion. Alewives, in particular, were portrayed as natural cheats, their work watched more closely than that of men. The persistence of these suspicions reveals a society deeply concerned with order not only in trade but in gender, reputation, and community life. The rise of beer. By the mid-16th century, a new drink began to complicate the picture: beer brewed with hops. Imported from the Low Countries, beer lasted longer, traveled better, and tasted sharper. It quickly gained popularity, especially in towns and among younger drinkers. The rise of beer introduced new challenges for regulators. Was beer subject to the same rules as ale? Should prices be fixed in the same way? Should ale conners, trained in ale, also judge hopped beer? Confusion reigned, and with it came new opportunities for brewers to bend the rules. Some brewed half-and-half mixtures, combining ale and beer. Others relabeled their brews to avoid restrictions. Once again, the punishments were peculiar. Brewers accused of mislabeling might be ordered to pour their beer away in public or to display signs declaring their guilt. Yet enforcement lagged behind the pace of change, and beer steadily rose to dominance. The drink of discontent. Weak ale did more than disappoint drinkers. It could spark discontent. Records show instances where townspeople rioted over the quality of ale, accusing brewers of cheating the poor. Authorities feared such unrest, especially in years of poor harvest when grain was scarce. Regulations, inspections, and punishments were as much about preventing rebellion as about ensuring good drink. Toward the final pour. By now you can see that weak ale was more than a private flaw. It was a public matter, tied to trust, community, and control. But as beer rose and alewives struggled, the question became sharper. Did the regulations truly protect the people, or did they weigh most heavily on those who could least afford the burden? We have followed ale from its place as daily bread to the punishments of weak brewers, and from the struggles of alewives to the peculiar role of ale conners. Now we arrive at the final chapter, the decline of ale and the rise of beer. It is a story not of sudden change but of gradual transformation, shaped by shifting tastes, expanding trade, and the quiet persistence of regulation. The waning of ale. By the late 16th century, traditional ale was beginning to lose ground. Ale without hops soured quickly, lasting only a few days. This was acceptable in small villages, where brewing was local and frequent. But in growing towns and bustling cities, the short life of ale became a burden. Inns and taverns needed drink that could keep longer, travel further, and satisfy more diverse tastes. Ale still had its defenders. It was seen as wholesome, nourishing, and English, while beer was considered foreign, sharp, and perhaps even unhealthy. Some traditionalists resisted the shift, accusing beer of corrupting not only the body but also the social fabric. But resistance could not stop change. The triumph of beer. Beer brewed with hops had clear advantages. It stayed fresh for weeks, even months. It could be transported from larger breweries to distant markets. It allowed for new scales of production, moving beyond the household or small workshop into proto-industrial enterprises. As beer spread, so too did regulation. Officials who once measured the strength of ale now turned their attention to beer, setting prices and punishing those who cheated. Ale conners, though mocked, adapted their duties, becoming testers of both drinks. The rituals of inspection, tastings, fines, and humiliations continued, but the focus shifted. By the early 17th century, beer had largely overtaken ale in towns, though ale lingered in villages and households. The balance of English drinking had shifted, and with it the character of regulation. The fate of alewives. The rise of beer also changed who brewed. Large-scale beer brewing required greater investment, more equipment, and often male labor. Brewing shifted from the household trade of women to the larger operations of men. Alewives, once central to community life, found themselves sidelined. This shift was not simply economic. It carried cultural weight. The ridicule of alewives in plays and poems grew harsher, portraying them as relics of a backward age. Regulation, which had long punished them with fines and shamming, now helped push them out of the trade altogether. The decline of ale was also the decline of women's visible role in brewing. Regulation as control. Even as beer triumphed, regulation did not fade. Punishments for weak beer, false measures, or overcharging remained as tedious and humiliating as those for ale. Brewers still faced public waste, fines, and ridicule. Customers still demanded fairness, and officials still sought to maintain order. What had begun centuries earlier with the assize of ale continued under new names and forms. The lesson was the same. Drink was too important to leave unregulated. In a society where ale had been daily bread and beer its successor, the state insisted on shaping not only what people drank, but how it was made and sold. The legacy of weak ale. Though ale declined, the regulations around it left a legacy. They revealed the intimate link between food, drink, and authority. They showed how ordinary substances, barley, water, yeast, could become battlegrounds of trust and control. They also demonstrated how punishment could be peculiar, not in its brutality but in its dull persistence. Fines, inspections, wasted product, and public shame. For the drinker, the legacy was a pint on the table, reliable in strength and price. For the brewer, it was the constant anxiety of oversight, the knowledge that every barrel might be tested, judged, and condemned. Echoes in modern times. Today, you might think of regulations on food and drink as modern concerns: expiration dates, health inspections, quality standards. Yet the story of ale shows that these anxieties are centuries old. Just as the Tudor laborer demanded strong ale, the modern consumer demands safe food. Just as ale conners tested with odd rituals, inspectors today use clipboards and codes. The punishments remain familiar too: fines, closures, and public shame. The history of weak ale reminds us that regulation is not only about health, but about trust, fairness, and social order. Closing reflection. As you picture the Tudor tavern, its benches crowded, its tankards raised, think of the alewife at her barrel, the ale conner at his bench, and the brewer before the magistrates. Their world was one of ordinary drink, yet it carried the weight of law, punishment, and survival. And so we ask, when a society invests so much in regulating its daily bread, does it create security for its people, or does it brew a culture of endless suspicion? Story 4. Shoemakers' Secrets, Leather, Laws, and Life in Elizabethan England. When you picture Elizabethan England, your eyes may rise toward the towering ruffs, the embroidered gowns, or the shining suits of armor. But beneath all that splendor lay something humbler yet essential: shoes. Without shoes, merchants could not travel, soldiers could not march, and courtiers could not dance. The shoemaker's craft was a quiet foundation of society, and like all crafts in Tudor and Elizabethan times, it was tightly bound by laws, guild rules, and peculiar punishments. The shoemaker's world was one of leather, awls, and waxed thread. It was also a world of regulations that reached into every stage of the trade, from the tanning of hides to the cutting of soles, from the price of a boot to the width of its toe. Even the smallest deviation could bring reprimand. Shoemakers were not simply craftsmen. They were custodians of order, held to standards that sought to balance quality, fairness, and social hierarchy. Leather, a precious commodity. The shoemaker's first challenge was material. Leather was precious in Tudor England. Hides came from cattle, sheep, or goats, but the transformation from raw skin to usable leather required long and foul-smelling processes of tanning. Tanners soaked hides in pits filled with lime and tannin-rich solutions, sometimes using oak bark, sometimes even dog dung. The stench of tanning yards was infamous, and they were often placed on the outskirts of towns to keep their smell from respectable streets. Shoemakers relied on tanners but also distrusted them. Poorly tanned leather cracked, split, or rotted, and the shoemaker was blamed. Guilds issued rules requiring shoemakers to inspect their leather carefully. Using inferior hides could bring fines or worse. A shoemaker caught with poor leather might be ordered to destroy the shoes he had made, wasting hours of labor, or to sit through long hearings on quality standards. The material itself was regulated too. Laws attempted to control the export of hides, ensuring enough leather remained for domestic shoemaking. Smuggling hides abroad was treated as a crime, and shoemakers were urged to report suspicious activity. Thus, the humble shoe connected to the wider politics of trade and economy. The shoemaker's bench. Inside the workshop, life revolved around the shoemaker's bench. Tools were simple but specialized. Knives for cutting, awls for piercing, hammers for shaping, and wooden lasts, foot-shaped forms around which shoes were built. Work was slow, with each pair of shoes stitched by hand. Apprentices fetched water, waxed thread, or cut scraps, while journeymen handled more complex tasks. Shoemakers often worked in dim, cramped shops, the air filled with the smell of leather and pitch. Customers came to be measured, choosing between boots, slippers, or patent wooden overshoes that protected against the mud of city streets. A well-made pair of shoes was a source of pride, but mistakes were costly. A miscut sole or uneven stitching could waste leather, and waste was one of the gravest sins in a world where materials were dear. Regulations on shoes. Shoes, like clothing, carried social meaning. Laws dictated what kinds of shoes different classes could wear. The wealthy might have boots of soft leather, dyed and ornamented, while common folk were restricted to simpler designs. Extravagant footwear with long pointed toes or high heels was sometimes banned as wasteful or immoral. Guilds reinforced these rules, ensuring that shoemakers produced shoes appropriate to the wearer's station. To sell shoes above one's class was to risk fine or punishment. A shoemaker who gave a poor man boots too fine might be summoned before officials, accused of upsetting the social order. Punishments peculiar and tedious. As with tailors and brewers, shoemakers faced punishments that were rarely violent but often humiliating or draining. A shoemaker caught selling shoes at unfair prices might be fined or forced to sit in the stocks with a pair of shoes hung around his neck. Another who used poor leather could be ordered to remake the shoes at his own expense, unpicking his stitches and wasting days of labor. Guilds sometimes staged public inspections, laying out shoes in the marketplace and judging their quality before all. A shoemaker whose work failed the test endured not only fines but the loss of reputation, a punishment as damaging as any. Shoes and survival. For ordinary people, shoes were more than fashion. They were protection against cold, mud, and disease. A laborer without shoes risked injury or illness. A soldier without sturdy boots could not march far. A poor family might share shoes among children, passing them down until they fell apart. In this context, shoemakers carried heavy responsibility. Their work was humble but vital, and their failures were felt in the very steps of daily life. Toward tensions. Shoemaking, then, was not a quiet trade at all. It was a craft pulled between quality and cost, between regulation and demand, between pride and punishment. The shoemaker bent over his bench was not only shaping leather. He was navigating a world of rules, risks, and expectations. And so we must ask, when guild rules and laws pressed so heavily, how did shoemakers balance survival with obedience? Did they bend the rules as tailors and brewers did, or did they accept their punishments in weary silence? In the first part of this tale, we saw how shoemakers lived under the weight of regulation, bound by guilds and laws, and punished for waste or extravagance. But as with tailors and brewers, rules never entirely suppressed human ingenuity. Shoemakers found ways to bend, stretch, and sometimes defy the restrictions that pressed on their craft. These acts of rebellion were rarely grand, but they reveal the tension between survival and obedience in Elizabethan England. Cutting corners. One common form of resistance was the careful cutting of leather. A shoemaker might use thinner hides than allowed, saving material for other shoes. To the untrained eye, the shoes seemed sturdy, but they wore out quickly. Customers might complain, but the shoemaker had already made his profit. Others padded soles with scraps or mixed good leather with poor, disguising defects under polish and pitch. Guild inspectors occasionally discovered these tricks during inspections, laying shoes open to reveal their hidden flaws. Punishments followed: fines, wasted work, and public shame. Yet the practice continued, for the temptation to stretch expensive leather was ever present. Styles beyond the law. Fashion, too, provoked quiet rebellion. Laws sometimes restricted extravagant shoes/designs, high heels or pointed toes, but customers demanded them, especially among the young and ambitious. Shoemakers risked punishment to supply what buyers wanted. In London, guild records mention shoes of unlawful fashion seized and displayed in public. Yet these very styles often reappeared, suggesting that shoemakers and customers alike conspired to defy restrictions. It was a cycle: law, demand, rebellion, and punishment. The journeyman's struggles. Shoemakers' apprentices endured long years of service, but once free, journeymen faced their own hardships. They were paid by the day or by the piece, often at low rates. Masters controlled wages tightly, citing guild standards. Disputes flared when journeymen felt cheated. In some towns, groups of shoemakers' journeymen gathered secretly, forming early versions of workers' associations. They discussed wages, conditions, and grievances against masters. These gatherings were viewed with suspicion, for collective action threatened the guild's authority. When discovered, punishments were peculiar but firm: long lectures, public apologies, or temporary bans from working. Yet the discontent persisted, hinting at tensions that would grow in later centuries. The shoemaker's reputation. Shoemakers occupied an ambiguous place in society. On one hand, their work was essential. Everyone needed shoes, from peasants trudging through fields to nobles striding in palaces. On the other hand, shoemakers were sometimes mocked as crafty, sly, or quarrelsome. Plays and pamphlets joked about shoemakers cheating customers, drinking too much ale, or wasting time in gossip. This reputation may have stemmed from their visibility. Unlike goldsmiths or masons, whose work was rarefied, shoemakers dealt with everyone. Their shops stood on busy streets, their trade constantly under scrutiny. In this way, shoemakers lived under the double pressure of law and public opinion. Shoes and the wider economy. Shoemaking was also tied to the larger economy. Leather shortages sometimes sparked disputes between tanners, shoemakers, and customers. In times of war, soldiers' boots became a priority, and guilds enforced stricter rules on production. Shoemakers might be compelled to supply the army; their labor turned from profit to duty. These pressures revealed how even a humble trade was woven into national concerns. A poorly made boot could lame a soldier; a shortage of shoes could hinder a campaign. Thus, the shoemaker's all and last, tools of quiet craft, carried weight beyond the workshop. Punishments in practice. As in other trades, punishments for shoemakers were tedious rather than brutal. A shoemaker caught cheating might be ordered to remake shoes at his own expense, unpicking seams and wasting time. Others endured inspections where their shoes were cut apart in front of townspeople. The humiliation lay not in pain but in wasted effort and public disapproval. For repeated offenders, the punishments grew harsher. Some were barred temporarily from selling in markets, forced to watch customers pass by while their shops stood idle. This economic punishment was particularly heavy, striking at livelihood without leaving scars. Toward the question of survival. By now, you can see that shoemakers lived in a world of contradictions, bound by laws but tempted by fashion, respected for necessity but mocked for cunning, punished by guilds yet vital to society. Their rebellions were small, their punishments peculiar, but their struggles reflected larger tensions of Elizabethan life. And so we must ask, when the shoemaker finally achieved mastery, did the weight of rules lift, or did the guild's grip tighten even further, binding him in responsibility as surely as leather binds sole to upper? We have seen the shoemaker as craftsman, as rebel, and as laborer under scrutiny. Now we turn to his final stage, the shoemaker as master. To sit at the head of a workshop, to guide apprentices, and to oversee journeymen was a position of both pride and weight. But mastery brought not escape from rules, only new obligations. The guild stood behind every stitch, and the peculiar punishments of shoemaking did not vanish. They shifted form. The master's responsibilities. A master shoemaker owned his tools, his bench, and often his shop. He might have apprentices living under his roof, journeymen employed by the week, and customers from every rank of society. The master's name was tied to the quality of every shoe that left his bench. If an apprentice botched a sole or a journeyman used poor leather, the master bore the blame. Guild rules demanded that masters police not only themselves but also their workers. A master could be fined if his apprentice gambled in taverns, if his journeyman shirked work, or if his shoes failed inspection. Responsibility extended beyond the workshop walls. The master was answerable for conduct, quality, and reputation. This burden kept the guild's order intact, but it also trapped masters in endless vigilance. Their status carried honor, yet their freedom remained circumscribed by rules. Rituals of authority. Masters participated in the rituals of guild life. They attended meetings, paid fees, and voted on regulations. They judged the work of apprentices, deciding when a boy had earned the right to move on. They inspected shoes in markets, enforcing standards on others as they had once endured themselves. These rituals reinforced hierarchy and continuity. The guild was not only an economic body, but a moral one, shaping behavior through ceremony as much as through fines. Public inspections of shoes, readings of regulations, and feasts of admission all reminded masters that their craft was both a privilege and a duty. Punishments at the master's level. Even masters were not immune to punishment. A master who overcharged customers might be summoned before guild elders, forced to repay money and endure a public rebuke. Another who sold shoes of poor leather might be ordered to destroy them before all. In some cases, repeat offenders were suspended from trading, their workshops closed until they satisfied the guild. These punishments, though rarely brutal, were costly in time, money, and dignity. They reinforced the idea that even at the top of the craft, obedience was expected. The master's independence was always balanced by accountability. Shoes as symbols. Shoes carried meanings beyond practicality. A fine pair of boots marked status. A patched shoe spoke of poverty. Guild rules ensured that these symbols remained orderly. A poor man was not to wear shoes too fine, lest he blur the lines of rank. A noble's shoes were to be made with proper materials, lest his dignity be compromised. The shoemaker thus became a quiet enforcer of social order, stitching class distinctions into every pair. Punishments for breaking these boundaries reflected the seriousness with which society guarded its hierarchies. The broader economy. By Elizabeth's reign, England's economy was expanding. Trade with Europe brought new leathers, dyes, and fashions. Guilds sought to regulate these imports, fearing disruption of local trades. Masters were caught between innovation and obedience. A shoemaker who adopted new styles might attract wealthy customers but risk guild censure. A conservative master might preserve rules but lose business. This tension mirrored broader shifts in society. Old forms of control strained against new economic forces, and the shoemaker's workshop became a microcosm of this struggle. The legacy of the craft. Shoemaking in Elizabethan England may seem small compared to the dramas of queens and wars. Yet in its quiet persistence, it reveals much about how society functioned. The craft was humble but vital. Its rules were dull but binding. Its punishments were peculiar but effective. Through shoes, we glimpse a society where order was enforced not only in courts and palaces, but in workshops and markets. Every stitch, every sole carried weight. The shoemaker's secrets were not of rebellion or scandal, but of endurance under rules that shaped both craft and community. Closing reflection. As you picture the shoemaker at his bench, all in hand, leather stretched before him, Think of the layers of order stitched into his work. His shoes carried people through muddy streets, into markets, and across fields. They also carried the weight of laws, guild rules, and peculiar punishments that ensured society remained measured and bound. And so we must ask, in a world where even shoes were policed by law, was the shoemaker a free craftsman shaping leather or merely another thread in the fabric of order, held in place by the patient stitching of rules? Story 5. The Parish Poor Box, Early Welfare in the English Countryside. When you think of welfare or charity today, you might imagine state programs, organized relief, or vast institutions of aid. In Tudor and Elizabethan England, however, welfare rested on something much smaller, simpler, and more peculiar: the parish poor box. A locked chest often set near the church door, it became the repository of alms and the symbol of obligation. It was at once humble and powerful, a wooden container that carried the burden of community survival. Poverty in the countryside. The English countryside of the 16th century was not free of want. Harvests failed, wages wavered, and enclosure of common lands pushed many off their traditional livelihoods. Laborers without steady work wandered in search of bread, and widows, orphans, and the elderly often found themselves with no means of support. Poverty was visible. It sat at the edge of villages, in cottages with thatched roofs patched with straw, in families that begged for bread at the doors of wealthier neighbors. The parish, the basic unit of both church and civil life, was expected to respond. The birth of the parish poor box. In the early 16th century, the church and crown encouraged parishes to establish poor boxes. These were sturdy wooden chests with iron locks and narrow slots, placed at the doors of churches so that parishioners might drop coins as they entered or left. The system was both simple and deliberate. The poor were not to beg from house to house, which was considered disruptive and disorderly. Instead, they were to receive relief through the parish, funded by the coins gathered in the box. In this way, charity was organized, supervised, and tied to the authority of the church. Regulation of giving. The parish poor box was not merely a suggestion. By the mid-Tudor period, laws required parishes to maintain them. Churchwardens were responsible for ensuring that the box was in place, the locks secure, and the money recorded. Parishioners were expected, sometimes pressured, to give. Refusal to contribute could bring public shame. Names of the ungenerous might be noted, their reputation whispered about in the village. In some cases, officials visited households directly, reminding them of their duty. Giving was not always voluntary. It was a civic obligation, enforced with the quiet pressure of community opinion. Distribution of alms. The money collected was used for practical relief: bread, fuel, clothing, and sometimes small sums of coin. Churchwardens, often with the help of parish overseers, distributed aid to those deemed deserving poor. The deserving were widows, orphans, the sick, and the elderly, those unable to work. The undeserving, such as able-bodied wanderers or those suspected of idleness, were often excluded. The poor box, then, was not merely charity. It was a mechanism for judgment, dividing the worthy from the unworthy. This distinction reflected deep anxieties about poverty. Aid was meant to preserve order, not to encourage dependence. The box gave, but it also controlled. Punishments and peculiarities. Even the poor box had its punishments. Churchwardens who failed to maintain it could be fined or scolded by higher officials. Parishioners who refused to give were subject to public rebuke, and those caught stealing from the box, whether poor or not, faced severe penalties. One record tells of a man whipped for breaking into a poor box, not because the sum was large, but because the crime was symbolic. To steal from the poor was seen as a violation of community trust. The punishment was designed not only to chastise, but to remind everyone of the sanctity of the box. The box as symbol. Beyond its practical use, the poor box stood as a symbol of community responsibility. Placed at the church door, it was visible to all. Each coin dropped into its slot echoed with the weight of obligation, each refusal to give marked silently by the eyes of neighbors. It was a system that depended on boredom and routine. Week after week, parishioners walked past, giving their pennies. Week after week, church wardens unlocked the box, counted coins, and recorded amounts. Nothing dramatic but deeply significant. Toward greater organization. As poverty deepened in the later 16th century, the parish poor box became part of a larger system. By Elizabeth's reign, laws required parishes to appoint overseers of the poor and to levy compulsory poor rates taxes that formalized what the box had begun. The humble chest by the church door, once a symbol of voluntary alms, now pointed toward the birth of organized welfare. But in its earliest form, it carried peculiar burdens, small coins, heavy expectations, and the quiet discipline of community judgment. An open question. And so we pause with a question. When charity became obligation, did the parish poor box truly relieve the poor, or did it merely reinforce the power of the community to control who was worthy of aid? We left the parish poor box standing by the church door, a small chest of iron and wood that symbolized community duty. In this section, we will see how that box grew into a larger system of parish welfare. What began as voluntary almsgiving evolved into a structured, often tedious but deeply significant bureaucracy. Along the way came disputes, punishments, and the weary rhythm of counting coins and judging need. The overseers of the poor. By the later 16th century, Elizabethan laws required every parish to appoint overseers of the poor. These officials, usually drawn from local landowners or householders, were responsible for collecting alms, maintaining accounts, and distributing aid. The poor box remained, but it was now joined by compulsory collections known as poor rates. The overseers' duties were dull but heavy. They drew up lists of parishioners, calculated contributions, and recorded payments in ledgers. Each penny had to be accounted for. Failure to keep proper records could bring fines or sharp rebukes from higher authorities. In this way, charity became administration, deciding who deserved aid. The greatest burden of the overseers was deciding who should receive relief. The poor box and poor rates were not bottomless. Choices had to be made, and those choices revealed the values of the age. Widows with children might receive bread or fuel. The elderly might be granted small pensions distributed weekly. Orphans might be placed in households supported with parish funds. But able-bodied men without work were often refused, deemed sturdy beggars or idlers. These were expected to labor, not to receive alms. This constant sorting between deserving and undeserving poor created tensions. Families who received nothing sometimes protested, accusing overseers of favoritism. Those judged worthy often endured scrutiny, their lives examined to ensure continued compliance. Parish conflicts. Records from parish courts reveal disputes over poor relief. Some parishioners resisted paying their poor rates, arguing they had already given enough. Others accused overseers of misusing funds or of favoring relatives. In small communities, such quarrels could simmer for years, carried in whispers and complaints. The poor themselves sometimes protested, gathering at church doors or petitioning magistrates. Their complaints were rarely dramatic, but they reflected a persistent tension. The poor box was meant to bind the community together, yet it often exposed fractures of trust. Peculiar punishments. Enforcement of the system relied less on violence than on tedious penalties. Parishioners who refused to pay their poor rates were summoned before magistrates, forced to sit through long hearings, or threatened with seizure of goods. Overseers who failed in their duties might be fined or made to repeat their accounts in exhausting detail. Even the poor faced punishments. Those deemed idle or fraudulent could be whipped, set to work, or expelled from the parish. In this way, the poor box was not simply a source of relief. It was also a tool of discipline, shaping behavior through the quiet threat of bureaucratic punishment. The everyday routine. Despite conflicts and punishments, the daily life of the poor box was monotonous. Parishioners dropped coins week by week. Overseers unlocked the chest, counted the pennies, and entered sums in ledgers. Distributions were made in bread, coal, or clothing. It was routine, repetitive, and often dull. Yet in that very dullness lay its importance. The poor box normalized the idea that communities bore responsibility for their weakest members. It made charity into habit, and habit into law. The shift to compulsion. Over time, voluntary almsgiving through the poor box was overshadowed by compulsory poor rates. Still, the box remained, both symbolic and practical. It stood as a reminder of older traditions of charity even as the state formalized welfare. This transition reveals a broader change in English society, from reliance on personal generosity to reliance on structured obligation. The box by the door still received coins, but behind it stood ledgers, rates, and officials' layers of regulation shaping the flow of aid. Toward the end of the century, by Elizabeth's reign's close, the parish poor system had become a cornerstone of rural governance. The poor box was no longer an isolated chest. It was part of a network of responsibility linking parishioners, overseers, magistrates, and even the crown. And yet, questions lingered. Did these measures truly relieve the poor, or did they merely regulate them? Did the poor box stand as a symbol of compassion or as a reminder of control? An open question. As we prepare to examine the poor box in its final form, we are left to wonder, when charity hardened into law, did the poor gain more security or did they lose the freedom to ask, to wander, and to survive on their own terms? We have seen how the parish poor box began as a humble chest at the church door and grew into a system of compulsory poor rates. Now we reach the final stage, the integration of the poor box into the broader framework of the Elizabethan poor laws. In this transformation, a wooden container became a symbol of something larger, the institutionalization of welfare and the regulation of poverty. The Elizabethan poor laws. By the closing decades of the 16th century, poverty in England had grown more severe. Population pressures, rising prices, and disruptions in farming created widespread hardship. In response, Parliament passed a series of laws in the 1590s that formalized what the poor box had long represented: local responsibility for the poor. The Elizabethan poor laws required every parish to levy poor rates, appoint overseers, and provide relief to those unable to work. The poor box still stood in many churches, but it was no longer the primary source of aid. Instead, it became a supplement, a symbol of older traditions of almsgiving alongside the new system of taxation. Relief and regulation. Under the poor laws, relief became more systematic. The elderly received small pensions, children were apprenticed, and the sick were given food or fuel. But regulation grew stricter too. The able-bodied poor were expected to work, often in parish-organized labor. Vagrants were punished, sometimes whipped or expelled. The poor box now functioned less as a voluntary collection and more as a reminder. Charity had become obligation, and obligation had become law. What once relied on habit now depended on record-keeping, enforcement, and the weary grind of parish bureaucracy. The symbol of the box. Even as compulsory poor rates expanded, the box retained symbolic power. Its position at the church door reminded parishioners that giving was part of their faith and duty. Coins dropped into the slot echoed centuries of tradition, even as overseers carried ledgers filled with compulsory sums. To steal from the box still brought harsh punishment, for it was seen as stealing not only from the poor but from the community's collective responsibility. To refuse to give carried stigma, even when rates were compulsory. The box persisted, both relic and reminder. Community tensions. The transition was not smooth. Some resented the compulsory poor rates, arguing that charity should remain voluntary. Others complained of unfair distribution, accusing overseers of favoritism or corruption. The poor themselves often felt trapped, their lives scrutinized in return for meager relief. The poor box thus reflected both unity and division. It embodied the idea that the community should care for its weakest members, but it also exposed disputes about fairness, worthiness, and obligation. Punishments in the new system. With the formalization of relief came new penalties. Overseers who neglected their duties could be fined. Parishioners who refused to pay poor rates might face seizure of goods. The poor who defied regulations risked public whipping or expulsion. These punishments echoed the spirit of the old poor box, not brutal but wearying, humiliating, and relentless in their insistence on order. The legacy of the poor box. Though the poor box itself eventually faded from prominence, its legacy endured. It marked the beginning of organized, parish-based welfare in England, a system that would last for centuries. It represented the shift from charity as voluntary gift to charity as civic duty. And it showed how even the smallest object, a wooden chest with an iron lock, could carry profound weight in shaping society. Closing reflection. As you picture the poor box standing by the church door, worn smooth by centuries of coins, think of the lives it touched. The widow who received a loaf of bread, the child apprenticed with parish funds, the overseer bent over his ledger, all were part of its story. And so we ask, was the parish poor box a symbol of compassion, binding communities together in care, or was it a symbol of control, binding both rich and poor alike to a system of endless rules and judgments? Story 6. How many buttons? The quiet wars of fashion regulation. When you think of laws, you might picture courts, judges, or punishments for theft and violence. Yet in Tudor and Elizabethan England, the law also extended to the very clothes people wore. The cut of a sleeve, the width of a ruff, the color of a cloak, and even the number of buttons on a doublet could be subject to regulation. These were known as sumptuary laws, rules that controlled dress, food, and appearance in the name of order. Buttons, though small, became symbols of this system. A man with too many buttons on his coat might be accused not only of vanity but of violating social hierarchy. Tailors were watched, customers scrutinized, and guilds charged with ensuring obedience. The wars of fashion were not fought with swords but with thread, scissors, and endless lists of prohibitions. The purpose of sumptuary laws. At their heart, sumptuary laws aim to preserve social order. In a world deeply conscious of rank, clothing was a marker of status. Nobles wore silks and velvets, merchants wore fine wool, and laborers wore coarse cloth. If a poor man dressed above his station, he blurred these lines. Authorities feared such blurring would disrupt the harmony of society. Thus, laws dictated what materials, colors, and ornaments each class could wear. Gold embroidery, purple silks, and elaborate lace were reserved for the upper ranks. The middle sort were allowed modest adornments. The poor were restricted to simple garments. Even the smallest detail, such as a button, could become the subject of regulation. Buttons as a measure. Why buttons? In part because they were expensive. Buttons were not merely fasteners but ornaments, sometimes made of metal, glass, or covered in fabric. A coat bristling with buttons was a display of wealth. By limiting their number, laws attempted to curb extravagance and keep appearances in line with income. But buttons also represented control. Counting them was easy, and guild inspectors could quickly spot offenders. A tailor who sewed too many might be fined and his customer shamed. Thus, the button became both a decoration and a measure of obedience. Tailors and their dilemmas. For tailors, these laws created constant tension. Customers demanded fashionable garments, sometimes beyond their legal station. A young apprentice who had saved wages might ask for a coat with extra buttons. A merchant's wife might request silk trimmings forbidden by law. Tailors had to choose: obey regulations and risk losing business, or bend the rules and risk punishment. Records tell of tailors fined for sewing illegal garments, their work unpicked or confiscated. Punishments were rarely brutal but always wasteful, erasing hours of labor. A tailor might be summoned before guild elders, forced to explain why a customer's sleeve bore lace too fine or why a doublet displayed buttons too many. Punishments for wearers. Customers, too, faced penalties. A man caught wearing clothing above his station might be fined or forced to remove the offending garment. In some cases, garments were cut apart in public, the wasted fabric serving as a lesson to all. The humiliation was worse than the loss, for it revealed to neighbors that one had sought to rise above one's place. Such punishments echoed through communities. To see a neighbor's fine coat torn apart in the marketplace was to be reminded of the quiet wars of fashion. Order was enforced not through blood but through fabric and shame. A society obsessed with appearance. These laws reveal a society deeply invested in appearances. Clothing was not simply personal choice. It was a declaration of identity, wealth, and rank. By regulating garments, the state sought to regulate the very structure of society. Buttons, lace, and colors were as much about politics as about fashion. The tedious nature of these rules, the counting of buttons, the weighing of fabrics might seem absurd today. Yet in their very dullness lay their power. They worked not through spectacle but through repetition, reminding every tailor and every wearer that society was measured in cloth and thread. Toward conflict. And so we are left with a question. When laws pressed so closely upon the body, how did people respond? Did they obey meekly, wearing the allowed number of buttons, or did they find ways to resist, to bend rules, and to stitch defiance into their seams? In the first part, we saw how laws counted buttons and measured cloth, seeking to keep society neatly stitched into place. But clothing is never entirely obedient. Fashion moves, desires grow, and tailors with their scissors in hand cannot always resist the pull of style. In this section, we look at the quiet rebellions that unfolded in workshops, wardrobes, and marketplaces. Rebellions fought not with swords but with seams. The tailor's compromise. Tailors, always at the center of these struggles, learned to bend the rules carefully. Some made garments with hidden luxuries, linings of forbidden fabric sewn beneath plain exteriors, or stitches that allowed sleeves to be unpicked and refashioned into more fashionable shapes after an inspection had passed. Others risked outright defiance, sewing extra buttons or illegal lace when customers insisted. Punishments for such disobedience were familiar: fines, wasted labor, and public shamming. Yet customers rewarded the bold tailor with loyalty, and so the cycle continued. A tailor's reputation often rested on his willingness to dance between obedience and defiance. Customers and their defiance. Wearers, too, found ways to rebel. Some wore illegal garments proudly, daring officials to intervene. Others bent rules by combining items technically within allowance but together extravagant. A farmer's son might wear a simple doublet but add buttons enough to catch attention. A merchant's wife might wear fabric of allowed weight but dye it in costly hues. Authorities responded with tedious punishments. Fines collected, garments seized, and public scoldings issued. Yet enforcement was patchy. In towns, inspectors might be diligent, but in rural areas, violations passed unnoticed. The unevenness of punishment encouraged further risk-taking. The spread of fashion. Despite the laws, fashion spread quickly through England. Merchants imported fabrics, travelers brought styles from abroad, and plays on London stages displayed extravagant costumes. Audiences copied what they saw, demanding ruffs, slashed sleeves, and shoes with sharp points. The state could regulate, but it could not stop the flow of ideas. Each new style sparked new anxieties, leading to yet more laws. The cycle became endless. A fashion appeared, A law forbade it, people bent the rule, and punishments followed. The very repetition reveals the futility of the effort. The guilds and their burdens. Guilds bore much of the responsibility for enforcement. Tailors' guilds inspected shops, counted buttons, and fined offenders. But guilds also represented their members' interests, resisting when laws threatened their business. If customers demanded certain fashions, guilds risked losing trade if they enforced restrictions too strictly. Thus, guilds became conflicted enforcers, at once protectors of law and shields for their craftsmen. Records show endless debates within guild halls, balancing loyalty to authority against loyalty to trade. The outcome was usually compromise: enough enforcement to appease officials, enough flexibility to keep customers. Peculiar punishments. Punishments for fashion offenses often lean toward the symbolic. A coat with too many buttons might be cut apart in public. A hat with illegal feathers might be burned at the churchyard gate. A tailor found guilty of repeated offenses might be ordered to sit through long readings of regulations, his needles idle while he listened. The effect was not terror but weariness, a constant reminder that fashion was under watch, a dull pressure that shaped choices through repetition rather than fear. Fashion as social tension. Behind these quiet wars lay deeper anxieties. The nobility feared losing distinction, merchants sought to display their growing wealth, and the poor longed for dignity in dress. Clothing became a battlefield of status, its seams carrying the weight of ambition and order. The button, small though it was, symbolized this tension. Each extra button sewn was a declaration, of vanity, of ambition, or of defiance. Each punishment was a reply, seeking to stitch society back into its proper form. Toward the final stitch. And so we are left with the question: when laws failed to suppress fashion, what did they achieve? Did they preserve order, or did they merely reveal society's endless appetite for display? We have walked past tailors' benches, peered at coats bristling with buttons, and watched inspectors scold and fine. Now we arrive at the final stitch of this tale: the decline of sumptuary laws. For centuries they pressed against fashion, but in the end, the thread of regulation frayed, leaving only memories of peculiar punishments and tedious controls. The futility of control. By the late Elizabethan period, authorities themselves began to see the futility of enforcing sumptuary laws. Fashion moved too quickly, demand was too strong, and enforcement was too patchy. New fabrics from abroad, such as silks from Italy or dyed cloth from the Low Countries, entered England faster than laws could respond. Tailors bent rules, customers defied them, and inspectors grew weary of endless disputes over sleeves and buttons. The sheer number of laws repeated, revised, and reissued was evidence of their failure. If a law must be restated a dozen times, it is not being obeyed. Shifting priorities. As England entered the 17th century, political and religious struggles overshadowed fashion regulation. Wars, taxation, and debates over church government took precedence. Controlling the number of buttons on a coat seemed trivial compared to the weight of these new conflicts. Yet the spirit of regulation did not disappear. Instead, it shifted. While sumptuary laws declined, new rules arose around trade, imports, and taxes. The obsession with order remained, only the target changed. The legacy of the button. Even as sumptuary laws faded, their legacy endured. They revealed how deeply Tudor and Elizabethan society tied identity to appearance. Clothing was not personal choice but public declaration. To wear the wrong garment was to risk suspicion, punishment, or ridicule. The peculiar focus on buttons, lace, and feathers may seem absurd, yet it reminds us that control often begins with the small. To regulate the body was to regulate society itself. Punishments remembered. Though the laws weakened, memories of their punishments lingered. Stories of coats cut apart in marketplaces, of hats burned, and of tailors fined for stitches told future generations how seriously appearance had once been policed. These punishments were rarely brutal, but their dull persistence made them effective. They were designed to weary the disobedient into compliance, shaping behavior through repetition and shame. The persistence of fashion. Fashion, of course, triumphed. Buttons multiplied, ruffs grew wider, and lace flourished. The very extravagance authorities feared became symbols of England's cultural vibrancy. Plays, portraits, and poetry celebrated fashion rather than condemned it. The laws had failed, but the desire to display had not. Closing reflection. As you picture a Tudor tailor laying out cloth, scissors poised, think of the rules hanging over him. Each cut was a negotiation between law and desire, order and ambition. Each button sewn carried more than decoration, it carried the weight of hierarchy and the threat of punishment. And so we ask, when laws sought to bind fashion, did they preserve society's order, or did they simply stitch anxiety into every seam, leaving a legacy of regulation more remembered for its tedium than its triumph?